The storm came from nowhere, like death always does in the Arizona territory. Sarah Bennett pressed her palm against the cabin wall, feeling it shake beneath the weight of thunder that rolled across the desert like a wagon train of ghosts. She'd lived out here for 6 years, long enough to know when the sky meant business, but this felt different, angrier. Lightning struck so close, the smell of scorched earth filled the single room she called home. She stood at the window, watching sheets of rain turn the red dirt into rivers of mud. In the distance, a lone figure stumbled down the ravine, bent against the wind like a sapling about to snap. Sarah's hands found the rifle propped by the door. She'd seen enough trouble come down that path. Desert desperados, lost settlers, half dead from thirst, men running from things they couldn't name. But something about this figure made her pause. The way he moved, deliberate despite his obvious weakness, reminded her of something her father used to say. A man walking toward trouble is either brave or hopeless. She opened the door before she could think better of it. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cold hit her like a fist. The rain had turned to sleet, sharp little knives of ice that bit through her wool dress. The figure was closer now, maybe 30 yards out, and she could see it was a man. Tall, broad across the shoulders, but moving. Wrong. One hand pressed to his side, the other gripping what looked like a walking stick. "You there?" she called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Get yourself inside before this storm kills you." He stopped. For a moment, she thought he might turn and disappear back into the storm. Then he raised his head, and even through the driving rain, she could see his face clearly enough to know what she'd invited into her home, an Apache, and not just any Apache. The way he carried himself, even wounded, spoke of authority. A war leader, maybe, or a chief. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her neighbors, the Hendersons, found butchered in their beds last spring. Thought of the burned-out wagons she'd passed on the road to Fort Collins. But she also thought of the Hippocratic oath she'd taken before coming west. Back, when she still believed the world could be healed with good intentions and clean bandages, she lowered the rifle, but didn't set it down. "Inside," she said again, firmer this time. "Storm's not particular about who it kills." He moved toward her with surprising speed for a wounded man. Up close, she could see the dark stains spreading across his buckskin shirt, the way his breathing came shallow and quick. Blood loss. Significant by the look of it. He paused at her threshold, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable with. Then he spoke, his voice rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. "You are the medicine woman they speak of in the fort." It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded slowly. "I am. You're hurt." "I am dying." He said it plainly, like commenting on the weather. "But not in your storm." She stepped aside, and he entered her sanctuary with the weight of a man who knew this might be the last shelter he'd see. The door slammed shut behind them, and suddenly the cabin felt smaller, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. Sarah watched him take in her simple home, the narrow cot against the far wall, the table she used for surgery when the fort was overwhelmed, the shelves lined with jars of herbs and bottles of laudanum. His gaze lingered on the cross hanging above her bed, then moved to the medical books stacked beside her rocking chair. "Sit," she instructed, pointing to the chair near the stove. "Let me look at that wound." He hesitated, and for the first time, she saw something like uncertainty cross his features. "Your people and mine, we are not friends." "My people," she said, pulling a basin from the shelf, "are whoever needs healing. Now sit down before you bleed all over my floor." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. He eased himself into the chair with a grunt that spoke of pain held too long in check. Sarah lit the oil lamp, flooding the cabin with warm yellow light that threw their shadows long across the wooden floor. She moved behind him, her trained eye immediately assessing the damage. The wound was in his lower back, ragged and deep. Bullet hole, recent, maybe a day old. The fabric of his shirt had stiffened with dried blood, but fresh crimson still seeped through in places. "Who shot you?" she asked, reaching for her scissors. "Men with badges, men with fear." His voice was steady despite the pain. "I was returning from a peace council when they came upon us. My warriors fought well. And the others? Your men? Dead or scattered?" He winced as she began cutting away the ruined shirt. As it should be. A leader dies for his people, not the other way around. Sarah paused, scissors hovering mid-cut. In 6 years of frontier nursing, she'd heard a lot of last words, a lot of brave talk from men facing death. But this was different. This man wasn't boasting. He was stating a simple fact about duty and sacrifice that hit her like a stone. "You're not dying tonight," she said quietly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She worked in silence for a while, cleaning the wound with moonshine that made him hiss between his teeth, but didn't make him flinch. The bullet had passed clean through, missing anything vital by what looked like divine providence or pure luck. The real danger was infection and blood loss. "What's your name?" she asked, threading a needle with catgut. "I am called Tall Bear." He turned his head slightly to look at her. "And you are Sarah, the widow who talks to spirits." She nearly dropped the needle. "How could you possibly—" "We watch, we listen. We know the woman who lives alone, who tends the sick even when the fort doctors turn them away, who leaves water and blankets on the ridge for travelers." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd thought those small acts of mercy had gone unnoticed. "I do what I can. That is more than most." He was quiet while she began stitching, his breathing controlled, meditation-like. After several minutes, he spoke again. "Your husband, the war took him." Her hands stilled. 3 years ago, at Glorieta Pass. A hard battle. Many good men died on both sides. Sarah resumed stitching, grateful for something to focus on besides. The sudden tightness in her throat. "He was a captain, cavalry, always said he'd die with his boots on." She knotted the last stitch perhaps a bit too firmly. "He didn't. Dysentery got him 2 days after the battle. The warrior's death is not always glorious," Tall Bear said softly, "but honor comes from how we live, not how we die." She bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency, then helped him remove the tattered shirt entirely. His torso was a map of old scars, some from bullets, some from blades, one that looked like it came from a bear's claws. Each mark told a story of survival, of battles fought and somehow won. "Rest now," she said, making up a pallet near the stove. "I'll fix something to eat. You show great trust, leaving me armed in your home." Sarah glanced at the knife still sheathed at his belt, the tomahawk that hung from a cord at his waist. "If you meant me harm, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Besides," she added with a tired smile, "you're in no condition to fight. And I've got more medicines here than the fort's entire supply. Lots of ways to kill a man with healing tools." This time he did smile, and the transformation was remarkable. The hard lines of his face softened, revealing a man who might have been a teacher or a storyteller in another life. "You would make a formidable warrior, Sarah Bennett." She busied herself with the pot over the stove, trying to ignore how the compliment warmed her more than it should. "I'll settle for being a decent nurse." They ate in companionable silence, rabbit stew she'd made that morning, thick with winter vegetables. Tall Bear managed only a few bites, but color was returning to his face. The storm continued to rage, outside rattling the windows and howling like a living thing. "Tell me about your people," she said finally, "the ones who will come looking for you." His expression grew thoughtful. "They are my family, blood and bond. Warriors who have fought beside me for many seasons, women who raised my children after their mother died, elders who keep our stories alive. He paused, looking into the fire. They will search until they find me or my bones. It is the way. And when will they find you? Here, in my cabin. That depends on whether I'm alive or dead when they arrive. He met her gaze directly. If I die here, Sarah Bennett, you will have given shelter to an Apache war chief in his final hours. Some of your people would call that treason. Some of my people call a lot of things treason these days, she replied, collecting their bowls. I stopped listening to some of my people a long time ago. The night deepened around them. Sarah tended the fire, checked his bandages, administered small doses of laudanum when the pain became too much. Between his fitful bouts of sleep, they talked, or rather, he talked, and she listened. He spoke of the changing desert, how the old ways were dying as surely as men died in war, of children being taken to mission schools where they forgot their names and their tongues, of treaties made and broken, of sacred mountains sold to mining companies, of buffalo bones bleaching white in the sun. Your people see progress, he said during one of these whispered conversations. We see ending, not just of Apache, but of something older, something that held the world together in ways you don't understand. Sarah sat on the floor beside his pallet, the rifle across her lap, more out of habit than fear. Maybe we're both seeing endings, she said softly. This whole territory is changing. The war changed everything. Nothing feels permanent anymore. Nothing ever was permanent. That is the first lesson of the desert. He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. But some things should be allowed to die with dignity, not butchered for sport. A gust of wind hit the cabin so hard the whole structure groaned. Sarah found herself grateful for the storm's violence. It gave them this strange intimacy, this pocket of time outside the world's rules. You should rest, she said, noticing how his eyelids were growing heavy. Dawn will bring its own troubles. Dawn always does. He closed his eyes, but his hand moved to touch her wrist gently. Thank you, Sarah Bennett, for the medicine, for warmth, for seeing a man instead of an enemy. She left her hand where it was for a moment longer than she should have. Thank you for trusting me with your life. As he drifted off to sleep, Sarah settled into her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and she knew the night was far from over. Through the window, lightning continued to split the sky, illuminating a world that seemed to be tearing itself apart and rebuilding with each flash. She thought about tomorrow, about the questions that would come when the storm broke and people noticed 2 sets of tracks leading to her cabin, but only 1 set leaving. About the war between worlds happening right here in her one-room sanctuary, but mostly she thought about the man sleeping near her stove and how easily she'd made the choice to save him. How natural it had felt, despite everything she'd been, taught about savages and heathens and the proper order of things. The last thing she remembered before exhaustion finally claimed her was the sound of tall bears breathing, steady and strong now, mixing with the storm's symphony. And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Bennett fell asleep, feeling like she wasn't entirely alone in the world. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something like peace had taken root. Neither of them knew it would be the last peaceful night for miles around, or that dawn would bring more than just the end of the storm. But perhaps that was a mercy too. The not knowing, the brief illusion that healing a man's body might be simpler than healing the wounds between their peoples. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's dreams that night were filled with the sound of drums, though she would later convince herself they had only been thunder rolling across the desert like a promise or a warning, depending on which side of the storm you stood on. Morning came wrapped in silence so complete it felt like the world had been remade overnight. Sarah woke with a start, instantly alert. In that way soldiers learn and nurses inherit. The storm had passed, leaving behind air so crisp and clear it seemed to ring like a bell. She checked on Tall Bear first. His breathing was steady, fever minimal. The bandages showed only minimal seepage. In the grey light of dawn, she could see more clearly the lines around his eyes, the threads of silver in his black hair. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 50, maybe more. His face had the weathered dignity of a man who'd lived. Hard, but with purpose. Coffee. She needed coffee before anything else. As she stoked the fire and set the pot to boil, a sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, trying to move quietly, but failing on the wet ground. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved to the window. 3 men picked their way across. The muddy yard, led by Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison. She recognized the other 2, Jack Henley from the general store and Thomas Walsh, who ran the stable. All armed, all looking grim. "Bennett," Morrison called out when he was close enough. "Open up, need to talk." She glanced back at Tall Bear, still asleep, but his hand had somehow moved closer to his knife. Even unconscious, he sensed danger. "Morning." "Marshal," she called through the door. "Kind of early for social calls." Had word there was trouble out this way. Storm brought some unwelcome visitors through. Sarah's mind raced. Someone had seen Tall Bear arrive. Maybe the stable boy who sometimes helped with her supplies. Maybe someone is watching the ridge. "Only visitors I've had are the mice," she said, buying time. "And they're permanent residents." Now Sarah. Morrison's voice carried that patronizing edge men used when they thought women were being difficult. "We know Tall Bear's in there. Behind." Her. She heard the subtle shift of a man waking to danger. Tall Bear's eyes opened, immediately focused, immediately understanding the situation. "He's wounded," she called back. "Under my care, medical protection." Henley's voice cut in, sharp, with something uglier than concern. "Medical protection don't extend to war criminals, ma'am. That's savages wanted for the Henderson murders." "That's a lie." The words were out before she could stop them. "Tall Bear told me." "Oh, he told you." Walsh laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Well, if an Apache told you, it must be true. Next you'll be telling us he wasn't at the massacre at Coyote Springs either." Sarah's stomach clenched. The Henderson murders had been brutal, the entire family slaughtered. If they truly believed, Tall Bear was responsible. "Look," Morrison tried again, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that didn't match the guns in their hands. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just turn him over peaceful-like, and nobody gets hurt." "Including me?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Or will I accidentally fall down the stairs after witnessing a wanted man try to escape?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Tall Bear had managed to rise, using the chair back for support. His face was pale but determined. He moved to where she could see him and held out his hand for the rifle. "No," she said quietly. "Sarah." His voice was calm. "They will burn your cabin, destroy your life, all for the word of an Apache. Is that worth dying for?" "Maybe not dying for," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "but worth living up to." She turned back to the door. "Marshal Morrison, I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully. I've got a wounded man in my care, and I've taken an oath to do no harm. That includes letting you men kill someone under my protection." "You crazy woman," Henley snapped. "You're choosing sides with a murderer over your own people." "My own people," Sarah said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "include anyone suffering and in need of help. That's the oath I took. That's the woman I am." She heard Morrison curse under his breath, then, "All right, boys, we waited for something nice." The first shot came through the window, shattering glass across the floor. Sarah dove behind the table, grabbing Tall Bear and pulling him down with her. He grunted in pain but didn't cry out. "The back room," she gasped, already moving. "There's a root cellar." More shots peppered the cabin. Wood splintered, china shattered. Sarah crawled toward her bedroom, Tallbear following. Blood was seeping. Through his bandages again, the fresh movement tearing at his wound. In the back room, she threw aside the rug covering the cellar door. "Get down there. And you, someone's got to make this look convincing." He caught her wrist. "Do not die for me, Sarah Bennett." "Don't plan to." She helped him down the ladder, then grabbed what she needed, her medicine bag, the spare rifle from under the bed, and a box of ammunition. The shooting had stopped. They were probably reloading or repositioning. "Sarah," Morrison's voice again, "last chance. Send him out and we'll forget this whole thing." She climbed down into the cellar, pulling the door shut above them. The space was cramped, musty, carved out of red rock and reinforced with timber. She'd stocked it as a storm shelter, never imagining it would become a battlefield refuge. "There's a tunnel," she whispered, leading him deeper. "Dug it myself." Fear of storms turned out to be fear of something else entirely. The tunnel was narrow, barely shoulder width, but it opened into a small cave about 20 yards from the cabin. From here they could see her yard and the men positioning themselves for a siege. "3 of them," Tallbear observed. "Morrison knows tactics. The other 2 follow orders." "Can you ride?" Sarah asked, checking his bandages. "I can ride." His jaw was set in a way that meant he'd ride, whether he could or not. They watched as Morrison gestured to his men. One moved toward the barn, probably, looking for horses. The other circled around back. Morrison himself approached the cabin again. "Bennett, you got 1 minute before we burn you out." "The sorrel in the barn," Sarah whispered. "She's the fastest. There's a saddle in the 3rd stall." "What? About you? I'm not running from these men. This is my home." Tallbear studied her face in the dim light. "Why are you doing this? You owe me nothing. Your people, my people, are whoever needs help," she said, echoing her earlier words. "But more than that." She hesitated, then spoke the truth. She hadn't admitted even to herself. "I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people's hate define what's right." A smile creased his weathered face. "You are braver than many warriors I have known. Or crazier?" She handed him her father's old pistol. "There's a trail that leads north behind the old cottonwood. Follow it for 3 miles, then head west. Your people will find you. And if they find you instead, then they find a woman who helped their chief. They can decide what to do with that." The sound of breaking glass came from above. Morrison was making good on his threat. "Go," Sarah urged. "Now, while they're focused on the cabin." Tallbear gripped her shoulder with his free hand. "I will remember this, Sarah Bennett, and my people will remember. We pay our debts. Just survive. That's enough payment." He moved toward the cave mouth, then paused. "The drums you heard last night? They were real. My warriors. They have been searching." "How close?" "Close enough." His eyes held a promise. Close enough. Then he was gone, melting into the desert dawn like smoke. Sarah waited until she heard the sound of hoofbeats heading north before climbing back through the tunnel. Smoke was beginning to fill the cellar. Her cabin was burning. She emerged from the root cellar into a room transformed by fire and violence. Her carefully tended home, her sanctuary for 6 years, was being consumed. Morrison stood in the doorway, Henley and Walsh flanking him. "Well, well," Morrison said, lowering his rifle. "The lady returns. Where's your pet Apache?" "Gone," Sarah said simply, "along with my home, my possessions, and any illusion I had about civilized behavior." "You brought this on yourself." Morrison's voice carried a weariness that might have been regret in another man. "Harboring fugitives, choosing sides in a war that ain't yours." "This war," Sarah said, watching her medical books curl into ash, "seems to be everyone's whether they choose it or not." Henley stepped forward, eyes bright with a zeal that frightened her. "Where'd he go? Which direction?" "I don't recall." Walsh raised his rifle. "Maybe this'll help your memory." "Enough." Morrison waved him down. Damage is done. Let's get back to town. But Henley wasn't finished. People need to know what happens when you side with the enemy, when you forget which god you serve. I haven't forgotten anything, Sarah said quietly. Have you? The three men left her standing in the ruins of her home, watching everything she'd built go up in smoke. But as she stood there, breathing in the acrid scent of destruction, Sarah Bennett realized something surprising. She wasn't afraid anymore. The choice had been made. The line had been crossed. And somewhere to the north, a wounded Apache chief was riding toward his people with news that would change everything. In the distance, almost too faint to hear, came the low throb of drums. Not thunder this time, but something far more ancient and far more dangerous. The sound of a message being passed from ridge to ridge, from canyon to canyon. Help was coming, but for whom remained to be seen. Sarah shouldered her bag and started walking. She had medical skills, burned hands, and a story to tell. The desert would decide where she told it. Behind her, her cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks. Ahead, the sun climbed higher, promising a day that would test every choice she'd made in the darkness. The drums grew stronger, no longer distant but approaching, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that dawn had brought more than just the end of the storm. It had brought the beginning of something else entirely. The nearest settlement was Red Creek, 5 miles southeast. Sarah had never walked it before, always rode the supply wagon or borrowed a horse from the fort. Now, carrying nothing but her medical bag and the clothes on her back, each step measured the distance between her old life and whatever came next. The morning sun climbed mercilessly, turning the wet earth into steam that rose like ghosts around. Her boots, by the time she reached the crossroads, marked by a weathered wooden sign, sweat had soaked through her dress, and the drums had grown distinct enough to count the beats. She stopped beside the sign, reading its faded lettering. Red Creek, 3 miles Fort Collins, 12 miles Perdition, God help you. Someone had carved that last line years ago, and now Sarah understood the sentiment. The drums stopped. In the sudden silence, she heard something else, the approach of horses from the south. Too many to be Morrison returning, too organized to be random travelers. She had minutes, maybe, less to decide which direction to take. That's when she saw them. 4 Apache warriors materialized from the desert like they'd been painted there by the morning light. They sat their horses in perfect stillness, studying her with eyes that measured threat and intent. None of them were tall-bear. The leader was younger, perhaps 30, with a face like carved stone and scars that told their own stories. He wore no war paint, but his rifle rested casually across his saddle horn in a way that suggested convenience, not peace. "You are the nurse," he said, in accented but clear English. "I am." "Our chief?" "Alive when I last saw him, riding north toward the canyon country. His wound was healing, but he'll need rest and—" She gestured vaguely at her medical bag. "Proper care." The warrior exchanged looks with his companions. Something passed between them, some silent communication built on years of fighting together. "You burned your dwelling for him." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "I did what I thought was right. The white men will hunt you now. Your people will call you a traitor." "My people already called me many things. One more word won't kill me." The youngest of the warriors, barely more than a boy, spoke rapidly in Apache. The leader's expression shifted, not quite softening, but considering. "You have choices, nurse. The wagons you hear, they bring soldiers from Fort Collins. They know you aided our chief. They come to arrest or kill you." He nodded toward the rising dust to the south. "We offer different choice." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the wagon sounds grew clearer. Morrison must have sent word immediately. What kind of choice? You know our ways of healing. Our chief says you see beyond color, beyond nation. There are others who need your skills. Wounded warriors who cannot go to white doctors, children with fever, women. He stopped, jaw tightening. Many die because they fear your people more than death itself. The wagon sounds were close now. Sarah could make out individual voices, the jingle of harnesses, the metallic clink of weapons. You're asking me to leave everything I know. You already have. The warrior gestured toward the smoke still rising behind her. The question is whether you walk forward or wait for them to drag you back. A moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and consequence. In that moment, Sarah saw herself with sudden clarity, a woman already standing between two worlds, already marked as other by the very people who shared her skin. How far is your camp? Half-day's ride. And Tallbear? Our chief will be there by sunset if his wound allows. Sarah made her decision, the way she'd made every important choice in her life, not with her head, but with something deeper, some internal compass that pointed towards service rather than safety. I'll need to gather certain supplies. Red Creek has a pharmacy. The leader's eyes flashed with something that might have been approval. Ride with us. We will protect you in town. As if summoned by her decision, the lead wagon crested the hill behind them. Soldiers in blue, maybe 20 of them, led by an officer she didn't recognize. They saw the Apache immediately and reined up, hands moving to weapons. "Well," Sarah said, climbing onto the spare horse the young warrior offered, "this ought to be interesting." The ride into Red Creek was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. The Apache warriors flanked her like an honor guard, while behind them the soldiers maintained a careful distance. The townspeople lined the street as their strange procession passed, faces showing everything from shock to fear to confusion. Outside Foster's general store, the leader called a halt. "Get what you need. We wait." Sarah dismounted, very aware of every eye watching her walk into the store. Old man Foster dropped the bolt of cloth he'd been measuring when he saw her. "Sarah? Good Lord, girl, what in blazes?" "I need supplies, Mr. Foster, medical supplies, and I need them quickly. But you're with—" He gestured helplessly toward the window. "I'm with whoever needs healing." She moved to the medicine shelf, pulling down bottles of carbolic acid, rolls of cotton bandages, laudanum. "The Apache have been wounded. I'm going to help them." "Help them?" Foster's voice raised an octave. "Help the savages who've been killing our people." Sarah turned to face him, and for the first time in years, she didn't look away or lower her voice. "Help human beings who are suffering. Last I checked, suffering didn't recognize race or creed." The bell above the door jangled as Captain Marcus of Fort Collins entered, followed by two soldiers. His face was grim, eyes scanning the scene. "Miss Bennett, I need you to come with me." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Captain. You're under arrest for aiding enemies of the United States." The store fell silent, except for the ticking of Foster's wall clock. Through the window, Sarah could see the Apache warriors had formed a tighter formation, rifles now prominently displayed. "I aided a wounded man," she said carefully. "I'd do the same for any of your soldiers." "That man is suspected of murdering white civilians." "Suspected, not proven." Sarah set down the bottle she'd gathered, her hands surprisingly steady. "And even if true, does that make healing him wrong? Do we only treat the innocent?" Marcus's jaw worked silently. He was a career soldier, probably a decent man, caught between orders and conscience. Finally, he spoke. "Step outside, Miss Bennett. Let's discuss this like civilized people." The word civilized hung in the air like smoke. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Civilized people burning cabins, civilized people shooting wounded men, civilized people measuring worth by the color of skin. She gathered the medical supplies, left money on Foster's counter, and walked outside. The street had filled with people now. The entire town seemed to have materialized, drawn by the spectacle of Apache warriors in their midst. "Miss Bennet," Marcus began, but the leader of the Apache interrupted. "The woman chooses freely. No chains, no force. She comes with us to heal our people, or she stays with you to rot in your jail. But she must choose, now." The captain's hand drifted toward his sidearm. The Apache warriors shifted in their saddles, ready. The townspeople stepped back from the potential crossfire. In that moment, Sarah understood that her choice would affect more than just herself. The wrong word, the wrong gesture, could turn Red Creek's main street into a battleground. She looked at Marcus, then at the Apache leader, then at the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, all watching to see what the widow nurse would do. "Captain," she said slowly, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare. But I'm not under arrest, am I? You have no actual crime to charge me with. Aiding and abetting, providing medical care, which last I checked was still legal, even in Arizona territory." She took a deep breath. "I'm going with them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Traitor!" Another voice called, "Let her go!" Sarah climbed back onto her horse, medical supplies secured. As she settled into the saddle, she caught sight of a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd, Reverend Clark from the Methodist Church. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Bennet," he called out, stepping forward despite the tension. "Remember your faith." She met his gaze across the charged space between them. "I am, Reverend. That's exactly what I'm doing." The Apache leader gave a sharp nod. "We go." As they rode out of Red Creek, Sarah heard the captain ordering his men to stand down. Behind them, the town buzzed with voices, angry ones, confused ones, some that might have even been admiring. "You surprised me," the Apache leader said when they were beyond the town limits. "Most white people feared judgment from their own more than death." "I stopped caring about most people's judgment 3 years ago," Sarah replied. "When you've lost everything once, you learn what's really worth protecting." They rode in relative silence after that, the horses finding their rhythm across the rough terrain. Sarah found herself studying her companions, the way they moved as one unit, the silent signals they used, the casual competence with which they navigated land that seemed identical but was clearly mapped in their minds. The youngest warrior, the one who had spoken in Apache earlier, guided his horse closer to hers. His face was painted in simple patterns of red and black, but his eyes held an intelligence that reminded her of the medical student she'd known back east. "You speak our language?" he asked in English. "No, I'm afraid not. I will teach you if you wish. Words for healing, words for plants." He gestured toward the landscape around them. "Desert speaks differently than white man's books?" "I'd like that," Sarah said, surprised by the offer. "What's your name?" "Calls me David when white men must know. Apache name is—" He said something in his native tongue that sounded like wind through canyon walls. "Means one who watches storms." "Why storms?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Born during a great storm. Mother says lightning strike 3 times the night I came. Storm watcher ever since." They exchanged language lessons as they rode. Storm watcher teaching her words for medicine, pain, healing, while she shared the Latin names for the plants she recognized along the trail. The lead warrior, who Stormwatcher introduced as Wind Runner, occasionally corrected their pronunciations or added observations about the terrain. As they topped a ridge, the leader called a halt. Below them stretched a valley Sarah had never seen before, despite living in the territory for years. A river cut through it, lined with cottonwoods, and along its banks were temporary shelters, wickiups made of brush and hide. "Our camp," Windrunner said. "Temporary. We move often now, must stay ahead of the soldiers." Sarah could see people moving among the structures, figures bent over cook fires, children playing in the shallows of the river, herds of horses grazing in the meadow beyond. It looked peaceful, organized, nothing like the savage camps described in newspaper accounts. How many? 73, counting the wounded. And families? All families here. No warriors go to war leaving their people unprotected. This is our way. They began their descent, and as they drew closer, Sarah could see faces turning toward them. Some curious, some wary, some openly hostile. A woman emerged from one of the larger wickiups, elderly but moving with authority. She spoke rapidly in Apache to Windrunner, her eyes never leaving Sarah. The medicine woman wonders why we bring another white into our camp when whites have brought us only bullets and broken promises, Stormwatcher translated. Tell her, Sarah said, that I bring medicine for bullets and hands for broken bodies. Promises are for politicians. I'm a nurse. Stormwatcher relayed her words, and the translation caused a stir among the gathered people. The elderly woman studied Sarah for a long moment, then turned and spoke again, her tone different this time. She says you speak with a straight tongue. She will judge you by your hands, not your words. They made their way as Windrunner guided Sarah deeper into the camp. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, some brave enough to touch her horse as it passed. Warriors stood with arms crossed, assessing, but nobody threatened or challenged their presence. That's when she saw him. Tallbear sat outside a wickiup, propped against a backrest of river cane. His wound had been rebandaged with what looked like plant fibers, and despite his pallor, he was alert and upright. When he saw her, surprise flickered across his features. Before settling into something warmer, Sarah Bennett, you did not run very far. Turns out there's nowhere left to run, she said, dismounting. Your wound? Healing. Our medicine is different from yours, but effective. He gestured for her to sit beside him. Though I would welcome your opinion. As Sarah began examining his bandages, she was aware of the entire camp watching. The elderly medicine woman drew closer, studying Sarah's techniques with sharp, critical eyes. Sarah moved carefully, explaining each action to Stormwatcher, who translated for the gathering crowd. Your stitches hold well, she observed, checking the inflammation around the wound. But this poultice, what plants did you use? The medicine woman answered through Stormwatcher, listing herbs Sarah recognized, and some she didn't. Together, they compared methods, Sarah demonstrating how carbolic acid prevented infection, the medicine woman showing how certain bark combinations drew out poisons. She says you know white man's plant medicine, Stormwatcher translated. But you don't know the songs that make them truly work. Songs. Tallbear smiled at her confusion. Our healing uses more than plants, Sarah. Words have power. Intent has power. The spirit of the healer matters as much as the medicine itself. Then perhaps I have much to learn, Sarah said, surprising herself with the admission. The elderly woman nodded approvingly and began speaking rapidly to the gathered people. Several dispersed, returning with various ailments. A child with a persistent cough, a warrior with a weeks-old shoulder wound, a pregnant woman concerned about her baby's position. Sarah spent the afternoon moving through the camp, treating conditions that had been left unattended for months. Some were simple, infected cuts that cleaned well, fevers that broke with proper hydration. Others were more complex, requiring improvisation with available supplies. The elderly medicine woman shadowed her, sometimes nodding approval, sometimes offering corrections or additions. They developed a rhythm, combining Sarah's technical knowledge with traditional Apache methods. It was like learning to speak a new language, but one written in herbs and healing. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of copper and gold, Sarah found herself sitting beside Tallbear again. The camp had grown quieter. People settling in for the evening meal. The scent of cooking meat drifted from several fire circles. Why did you really come? He asked. It was more than just medical duty. Sarah considered the question. In the distance, she could hear children laughing, see families gathering around fires, observe the normal rhythms of life, continuing despite war and displacement. I spent 3 years hiding, she said finally, hiding from grief, from judgment, from life itself. Today, I realized I was tired of hiding. And now? She looked around the camp, at the faces that had already begun to feel familiar, at the wounded who needed her skills, at this community that existed in defiance of everything her government claimed was right and proper. Now, she said, I think I might have found a place where hiding isn't necessary. Tall Bear studied her face in the fading light. You understand what this means? Once you are seen as one of us, there is no going back to your old life. The soldiers will hunt you. Your people will call you a traitor. My people, Sarah said quietly, just burned my home because I helped a wounded man. I don't think traitor changes much. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, approached tentatively. She carried a wooden bowl filled with stew and offered it to Sarah with shy eyes. Thank you, Sarah said, accepting the bowl. The girl giggled at her attempt to pronounce the Apache words for gratitude, then scampered back to her mother. That's Redbird's daughter, Tall Bear explained. Her mother died in the raid at Salt Creek. Redbird has been caring for her alone since then. Sarah looked across the camp to where the girl had returned to a woman finishing the evening meal. The woman caught her eye and nodded slightly. Acknowledgement, if not quite acceptance yet. How do they bear it? Sarah asked. The losses, the constant moving, the danger. The same way you bore losing your husband, Tall Bear replied. By finding a reason to continue, by protecting what remains, by believing tomorrow might be different than today. As darkness fell, someone built up the central fire. People gathered around it, some bringing drums, others rattles made from gourds. The music began slowly, just a single drum beating a rhythm, like a heartbeat. Stormwatcher appeared at Sarah's side. You should come. Tonight is for stories, for remembering, for healing in a different way. Sarah followed him to the fire circle, taking a place on a log that served as a bench. Around her, faces appeared and disappeared as flames danced, creating a world that felt both ancient and immediate. An elder stood, his voice carrying easily across the assembly. He began to speak in Apache, his words rising and falling like incantation. Stormwatcher leaned close to translate. He tells of the time before, when animals and people could speak to each other, when the earth was young and generous. The story wove around them, punctuated by drums and the crackling fire. Children listened with rapt attention. Warriors nodded at familiar passages. Even Sarah, understanding nothing of the language, felt drawn into the rhythm of the telling. When the elder finished, others took turns. Some told recent stories, battles fought, friends lost, small victories achieved. One woman sang a song that brought tears to many eyes. Stormwatcher translated, She sings for her son, killed at Apache Pass. She says his spirit rides with the wild horses now. As the fire burned lower, the mood shifted from remembrance to acceptance. People began to leave the circle, returning to their wiki-ups. But some remained, and the conversation turned more personal. You have a story to tell, Windrunner asked Sarah. All who sit at fire can speak. Sarah hesitated. In her old life she would have declined, claimed she had nothing worth sharing. But something about the night, the faces around the fire, the day's events, made her speak. I have lost much, she began, Stormwatcher translating. My husband, my home, my place among my own people. She paused, looking into the flames. Today I chose to lose my old life completely, to save what I could of my soul. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward. Several people nodded, understanding loss in ways that needed no translation. But I have found something too, she continued. I found that healing knows no boundaries, that kindness exists beyond the barriers we build, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what truly matters. Her words hung in the night. Air for a moment before Stormwatcher finished translating. Then something unexpected happened. The elderly medicine woman, who had been so critical during the day, reached across the circle and briefly touched Sarah's hand. "She says," Stormwatcher explained, "that you have the true heart of a healer. The rest, the songs and ceremonies, these can be taught." The gesture moved Sarah more than she expected. In that simple touch, she felt acceptance, validation, and the promise of mentorship. The medicine woman smiled, her weathered face transforming. With warmth, as the gathering dispersed, Tall Bear appeared at Sarah's side. "Come, I will show you where you will sleep." He led her to a small wickiup at the edge of the camp. It was simple but well constructed, with a bed of furs and blankets, a small fire pit, and a place to store her medical supplies. "This was my sister's before she married," he explained. "You will be comfortable here." "Thank you." Sarah set down her bag, exhausted but strangely energized. "Tall Bear, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When I first saw you in the storm, I was terrified. Everything I'd been taught told me to run, to see you as an enemy." She paused, looking out through the wickiup's entrance at the dying fires, across the camp. "What's changed? In me, I mean. Why doesn't it feel like I'm betraying my own people?" Tall Bear was quiet for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said finally, "you are not betraying your people. Perhaps you are finally becoming who you were meant to be. The color of your skin doesn't determine the worth of your heart. The soldiers will come for you, for all of us now. Yes, they will come. But tonight we have peace. Tonight you have found your place. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles." He touched her shoulder gently. "Sleep well, Sarah Bennett. Tomorrow you begin learning the songs." After he left, Sarah sat on her new bed, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into night. Somewhere, a baby cried and was quickly soothed. A horse whinnied softly. The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves. She thought about the day's events, the choices made, the bridges burned. There should have been fear, regret, uncertainty. Instead, she felt something like peace. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Bennett fell asleep, feeling like she belonged somewhere. That the work she did mattered, that the person she was becoming was worth the cost of leaving behind who she had been. In her dreams that night, she heard drums again. But this time, they weren't calling her towards something unknown. They were welcoming her home. And in the distance, though she wouldn't learn this until morning, Captain Marcus sat in his tent at Fort Collins, writing a report that would change everything. A report that would bring not just soldiers, but civilians, settlers, and politicians demanding answers. The peace wouldn't last. But for tonight, in a hidden valley in Apache territory, a woman named Sarah Bennett had found her place in a story much larger than herself. The next morning would bring the song lessons, and the day after, the first scouts would appear on the ridges watching the camp, and the day after that the real test would begin. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Bennett slept without dreaming of drums warning her of storms to come. Instead, she dreamed of songs that healed, hands that helped, and a community that had room for one more broken soul trying to find her way toward something like redemption. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. But in one wickiup at the edge of an Apache camp, a white woman slept peacefully among people she'd been taught to fear, having chosen a path that would reshape her understanding of where home could be found. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. But tonight was for rest, for acceptance, for the quiet moment before the storm truly began. And in his own wickiup, Tall Bear sat awake longer than usual, considering the woman who had risked everything to save his life. He had seen her strength, her stubbornness, her compassion. He had also seen the soldiers gathering at the fort, the angry townspeople demanding action, the political pressure building like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Sarah Bennett had chosen to stand with his people, Now it remained to be seen whether his people could protect her from the consequences of that choice. The drums were silent that night, but thunder, as always, was waiting to return. Sarah woke to the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. Not the sharp crack of hunting rifles, but the disciplined volleys of military carbines. She was out of her wickiup before consciousness fully returned, medical bag in one hand, rifle in the other. The camp had already sprung into motion with practiced efficiency. Warriors grabbed weapons while women gathered children. The elderly moved toward predetermined defensive positions. This was not their first attack. "How many?" she called to Stormwatcher as he ran past. 24 soldiers. "Maybe more is coming." He paused, breathing hard. "They have the high ground, East Ridge." Sarah's mind raced. 24 soldiers meant Captain Marcus had disobeyed his orders to wait for reinforcements. The confrontation in Red Creek had forced his hand, political pressure overriding military caution. Wounded? Not yet, but soon. Stormwatcher gestured toward the river crossing. "They push us toward the canyon. No escape that way." She understood immediately. The soldiers weren't trying to overrun the camp. They were herding them into a box canyon where the Apache would have no choice but to surrender or fight to the death. Windrunner appeared beside them, war paint already applied. "Tall Bear wants you in the medicine lodge, protected." "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "My place is with the wounded. You are not warrior." "I'm not a warrior," Sarah interrupted, "but I'm not hiding either. Point me toward the wounded." Windrunner studied her face, then nodded curtly. "Behind the large wickiup. Stay low. Bullets don't care about healers." Sarah moved through the chaos, noting how the Apache defense took shape. Warriors positioned themselves behind every bit of available cover, logs, rocks, the slight rise of ground near the river. Women and children disappeared into sheltered areas, but several women stayed, reloading weapons for the men. The first wounded warrior came stumbling back from the forward position, blood streaming from his shoulder. Sarah met him halfway, guiding him behind the medicine lodge, where the elderly woman had already begun laying out supplies. "Bullet went through," she assessed quickly, pressing cloth against both entry and exit wounds. "Clean, you're lucky," he grimaced. "Today, luck means dying slow instead of fast." More gunfire erupted, and 2 more wounded made their way back. Sarah's hands moved automatically. Pressure here, tourniquet there, laudanum for the worst of the pain. The elderly medicine woman worked beside her, their different approaches complementing each other, without the need for words. Then Tall Bear appeared, his face grim. "They've brought a mountain howitzer. Single cannon, but enough to destroy the camp if they position it right." Sarah's stomach dropped. A howitzer meant this wasn't just a disciplinary action. Someone wanted the Apache eliminated permanently. How long? Maybe an hour. They need to drag it up the slope. His eyes met hers. "Sarah, there's something you should know. Captain Marcus sent word before they attacked. He's not here by choice. Politicians in Washington are demanding results, and your defection gave them the excuse they needed." "My defection?" "The famous Red Creek nurse joining the Apache. It's already in the territorial newspapers. White woman abandons civilization for savage ways." Makes for good headlines when you want to justify a massacre. The word hit her like a physical blow, not just an attack, a massacre. The children she'd treated yesterday, the women who had shared their fire, the warriors who had accepted her presence. All of it calculated to end here, in this hidden valley. "There has to be another way," she said, checking the pulse of an unconscious warrior. "Surrender negotiation, Mrs. Bennett." The voice cut across the gunfire, amplified through a speaking trumpet. "Captain Marcus. Mrs. Bennett, if you're in there, you have 1 minute to show yourself. Your people want you safely home." The fighting paused. Both sides held their fire, waiting for her response. Tall Bear grabbed her arm. "Don't, Mrs. Bennett!" Marcus called again. "We know you've been taken against your will. Come out now, and no one else needs to die." The lie was beautifully crafted. By painting her as a captive instead of a volunteer, they could justify destroying the camp while claiming to rescue her. Dead Apache told no stories, and a traumatized nurse could be coached into whatever narrative served the government's purposes. Sarah looked at the wounded around her, then at the women shielding children, then at Tallbear, whose trust she had earned at such cost. In that moment, she understood something that 3 years of grief hadn't taught her. Sometimes the only way to save what you love is to sacrifice everything you have left. "I'm going out there," she said. "No, not to surrender." She opened her medical bag, pulling out a small bottle she kept hidden behind the laudanum. "Tell me, what do your songs say about poison?" The elderly medicine woman's eyes sharpened. She spoke rapidly in Apache. "She knows this plant," Stormwatcher translated. "White man's sleeping medicine, too much kills." Sarah nodded. "Exactly." She looked at Tallbear. "How many soldiers did you see?" "Honestly, more than we can fight. 50, maybe 60. They held some in reserve. And they're expecting me to walk out, traumatized, grateful for rescue." She stood, checking the cylinder of her revolver. "What if I give them exactly what they expect?" Understanding dawned in Tallbear's eyes. "You would die for us?" "I would live for you," she corrected. "But if dying is what it takes—" She pressed a piece of paper into his hand. "I wrote this last night. Testimony about the healing traditions. I've seen the innocent families in this camp. Get it to someone who matters. Reverend Clark, maybe. He seemed different." The medicine woman stood abruptly, speaking urgently. "She says no," Stormwatcher translated. "We do not sacrifice healers. It is taboo." "Then change the taboo," Sarah said gently. "Or change the world. Right now, I'm the only chip we have to play." The gunfire had resumed, more sporadic now. Both sides conserving ammunition, waiting for something to shift the stalemate. Stormwatcher touched her arm. "There is another way. Secret path through the rocks. Not all must die here." "How many can escape?" "Women and children. Some elders. Maybe half the warriors." "And the rest?" His silence answered her question. Sarah closed her eyes, seeing the faces of every child she'd treated, every warrior she'd bandaged. "Mathematics of death, calculated in heartbeats and lives. Show me the path." He led her to a narrow cleft between boulders at the western edge of camp. Hidden from the soldiers' position, it angled down toward a dry creek bed that could conceal movement. "You could go," Tallbear said, joining them. "Escape with the others. We would not blame you. And live with knowing I could have saved some of you and chose to save myself." She shook her head. "I've spent 3 years running from guilt. I won't start living with regret too." The old medicine woman approached, carrying something wrapped in soft leather. She unwrapped it to reveal a small pouch, dried herbs mixed with something darker. "She says," Stormwatcher explained, "if you choose death over dishonor, use this. Easier than white man's poison. No pain, just sleep." Sarah accepted the pouch, touched by the gift, the acceptance it represented. "Tell her I hope I won't need it, but thank her for understanding why I might." "Mrs. Bennett," Marcus's voice again. "Final warning. Come out now, or we open fire on the entire camp." The howitzer boomed in the distance, a test shot that sent a fountain of earth skyward 50 yards short of the wiki-ups. The message was clear. Next time they wouldn't miss. "Go," Sarah told Tallbear. "Get your people out. I'll buy you time." How will you? "I'm going to do what white women do in the Penny Dreadfuls," she said with a bitter smile. "I'm going to faint, dramatically. And while they're trying to revive their precious rescued captive, you run." She started walking toward the edge of camp, medical bag left behind, hands visibly empty. As she moved, she heard the rapid whispers behind her. the organization of escape, the quiet gathering of essential supplies. "Don't shoot," she called out, her voice cracking with manufactured fear. "I'm coming out. They kept me prisoner. But I escaped." She stumbled into view, clothes torn from her crawl through the rocks, hair wild, playing the role of traumatized captive. The soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, creating the opening she needed. "Thank God," Marcus called back. "Come forward slowly." She took 3 steps, 4, then let her knees buckle. As she fell, she saw movement at the edge of her vision. Families slipping away through the cleft in the rocks, warriors providing covering fire. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground. Soldiers surrounded her, blocking the Apache's line of sight. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" A young corporal's voice, genuinely concerned. Sarah let her eyes flutter open, focusing on Marcus's face. "Captain, are you real? You're safe now. Mrs. Bennet, we're taking you home." "Home," she repeated, injecting longing into the word. "Yes, please, take me home." But even as they helped her toward their lines, she kept her right hand clenched around the medicine woman's pouch. Just in case they saw through her performance, just in case desperate measures became necessary, behind her, gunfire resumed with renewed intensity. The Apache were fighting with everything they had, making each soldier pay for every inch of ground. But they were also moving, evacuating, using her sacrifice to save those who could be saved. As the soldiers carried her beyond the Apache's range, Sarah allowed herself one look back. Smoke rose from the valley now, mixing with gun smoke to obscure the details of retreat and death. She tried not to count the figures scattered on the ground, tried not to recognize them as specific people she had known, however briefly. "You're safe now," the corporal repeated, misreading her expression. "Those savages can't hurt you anymore." "No," she agreed softly, closing her eyes. "They can't, but the soldiers could, the politicians could. The newspapers that would write about the successful rescue of a white woman from Apache captivity could hurt in ways that bullets never managed." An hour later, Sarah sat in Captain Marcus's tent, wrapped in a government-issued blanket, sipping lukewarm coffee. The attack had ended as these things always did, the Apache melting away into the landscape, leaving behind destroyed shelters and stories that would be written by the victors. "Mrs. Bennet," Marcus began gently, "I need to ask you some questions." "For the official report." "Of course, Captain. Can you tell me how long the Apache held you?" Sarah looked into her coffee, seeing not dark liquid but the faces around last night's fire, hearing not silence but the songs that still echoed in her. "Mind, they didn't hold me, Captain. I went willingly." The tent fell silent. Marcus set down his pen. "Mrs. Bennet, I don't think you understand." "No," she interrupted, meeting his gaze. "I don't think you understand. I wasn't captured. I chose to help wounded people. I chose to use my medical training to save lives regardless of whose lives they were." "You're in shock," he said firmly. "It's natural to sympathize with captors, especially when they're not captors. They're people, families, children who get sick, warriors who bleed, elders who remember when this land knew different laws." She stood, letting the blanket fall. "Captain Marcus, I know what you need to write in your report. I know what Washington wants to hear, but I also know what I've seen these past weeks, and I won't help you justify it." Marcus's face hardened. "Mrs. Bennet, you're either a victim of Apache aggression or a traitor to the United States. Those are your choices." "No," Sarah said quietly. "Those are your choices. Mine was whether to heal or to harm. I chose to heal." The tent flap opened and a lieutenant entered. "Sir, we found something you need to see." Marcus followed him out, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her half-empty coffee cup. Through the tent walls, she could hear fragments of conversation, documents, evidence, collaboration. She smiled ruefully. They'd found the paper she'd given Tall Bear, or copies of it. The Apache were more clever than the army gave them credit for. When Marcus returned, his expression had shifted. The paternal concern was gone, replaced by military. And calculation. Mrs. Bennet, I'll be direct. You can claim you were forced, that you acted under duress. The newspapers will write you as a hero, the brave nurse who endured captivity to gather intelligence. You'll be celebrated, protected, or you can insist on this story of voluntary aid to the enemy, in which case I'll have no choice but to arrest you for treason. The choice hung between them like smoke. Sarah thought of her destroyed cabin, her burned bridges, the life she'd already sacrificed. She thought of Stormwatcher teaching her Apache words, of the medicine woman accepting her into the healing circle, of children who had smiled at her attempts to speak their language. Captain, she said finally, I've been running from the truth for 3 years. I'm done running. Mrs. Bennet. My name is Sarah. Just Sarah, and I stand by every choice I've made. Marcus nodded slowly, then called for the lieutenant. Place Mrs. Bennet under arrest. Charge her with providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. As they led her out of the tent, Sarah caught sight of the valley where the Apache camp had been. The sun was setting now, painting the sky, in colors that reminded her of war paint and sacred ceremonies. Somewhere out there, if all had gone according to plan, families were reuniting, children were being comforted, wounds were being tended by capable hands. It was enough. It had to be enough. The guards led her to a supply wagon converted into a temporary jail. As she climbed in, she noticed something tucked beneath one of the crates, a small bundle wrapped in familiar leather, the same kind the medicine woman had used for her gift. Inside, she found dried herbs, bandages made from soft hide, and a note written in careful English. Songs work best when sung with true heart. We remember, we do not forget. One who watches. Sarah pressed the bundle to her chest, wondering how they'd managed to leave it here under the noses of armed soldiers. Perhaps some kinds of magic worked regardless of armies or governments. As the wagon rolled toward Fort Collins, and whatever fate awaited her there, Sarah Bennet closed her eyes and hummed softly. The melody came without effort, one of the healing songs she'd heard last night, when the world had seemed full of possibility instead of charged with consequence. The guard looked at her strangely, but said nothing. Let him think her mad. Madness was easier to explain than the truth, that some choices once made changed you so completely that prison walls seemed like just another kind of shelter. And somewhere in the desert night, drums began to beat again. Not in warning this time, but in farewell and in promise. The storm had finally broken. Now came the questions of what could grow in its aftermath, and whether the price of truth was worth the harvest it might bring. Sarah hummed louder, filling the wagon with music that belonged to no single nation, that recognized no boundary between healer and warrior, between choice and consequence. Tomorrow would come with its trials, but tonight, she sang. And deep in her heart, she knew she'd finally found a song worth singing, even if she had to sing it from behind bars. The stars wheeled. Overhead, the same stars that shone on Apache camps and army forts alike. Neither justice nor mercy belonged exclusively to either side. But truth, Sarah had discovered, sometimes required its own kind of courage, and sometimes that courage looked like healing in the face of those who would rather see wounds fester. Sometimes it looked like standing alone against those who demanded you choose a side in a war where humanity had already lost. As the wagon disappeared into the darkness, the desert kept its own counsel. The Apache drums echoed one last time, then faded into silence, but in certain canyons, if you knew how to listen, you could still hear them. And in a prison wagon bound for Fort Collins, a woman named Sarah Bennet hummed healing songs and waited to see what truth would cost her next. The crisis had passed. The confrontation had ended. What remained was the long aftermath, where real change happened slowly. One song, one choice, one act of defiance at a time. Some wars were won with bullets, others with the stubborn insistence that all lives carried equal weight. Sarah had chosen her weapon. Now came the reckoning. Sarah spent her first night at Fort Collins in the Stockade, a small stone building that had been designed more for drunk soldiers than political prisoners. The single window faced east, and through it she watched the sunrise paint the desert in familiar colors. Even here, locked away from everything she'd chosen, the land connected her to those still out there, still running. Major William Graves arrived before her breakfast, hardtack and coffee so thin it might have been tea. He was older than Marcus, with silver threading his beard and the kind of lined face that came from 20 years of frontier duty. He carried a folder thick with papers. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, settling onto the rough wooden bench across from her. "You've created quite a situation. I've provided medical care to wounded people, Major. I wasn't aware that was criminal." He opened the folder, studying its contents. "According to these reports, you not only treated wanted fugitives, but lived among them, participated in their councils, and actively helped them evade capture. I helped them survive. There's a difference. Not in the eyes of the law." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I served with your husband at Glorieta Pass. Good man, excellent soldier." The personal touch caught her off guard. "You knew Daniel. Captain Bennett saved my life during that battle, carried me across 100 yards of open ground under Confederate fire." Graves touched a scar visible above his collar, took shrapnel to the shoulder doing it. "He was everything the army wants in an officer. He was everything anyone could want in a man," Sarah said quietly, "which is why I'm trying to understand how his widow ended up consorting with hostiles." "They're not hostiles, Major. They're people, fighting for their homes, their families, their right to exist as they choose." Graves sighed, closing the folder. 3 white families were murdered last month. The Henderson massacre you know about. The Webbs, found dead outside Phoenix. And the Morrisons, all 5 children killed with the parents. Tallbear had nothing to do with those murders, and the children in his camp weren't responsible for white families dying any more than white children are responsible for Apache women being raped by soldiers. "Watch your tongue, Mrs. Bennet." "Why?" "Because the truth is uncomfortable. Because it's easier to see one side as civilized and the other as savage." She stood, pacing the small space. "Major, I've seen both sides now. The capacity for cruelty exists everywhere. So does the capacity for kindness. The territorial governor is arriving tomorrow. He's already spoken with newspaper editors in Phoenix and Albuquerque. The story they're running is about an army rescue, saving a kidnapped nurse who bravely endured captivity while gathering intelligence on Apache movements. That's not what happened. No. But it's what the people need to hear. It's what maintains. Order prevents panic. He stood, moving to the small window. "Sarah, you have a choice. Sign this confession stating you provided information under duress. Accept the governor's commendation for your bravery. Return to your life with honor intact. Or face trial for treason, possible execution, certain imprisonment. All for people who would sell you to the highest bidder without a second thought." Sarah moved beside him, looking out at the morning activities of the fort. Soldiers drilling, horses being saddled, life continuing as though yesterday's violence had been routine business. "When Daniel was dying," she said slowly, "the surgeon had given up. Nothing more to be done. But Daniel fought the fever for 2 more days, clinging to life. You know what his last words were?" Graves shook his head. "Take care of whoever needs it. Not take care of our people or take care of the white folks. Whoever needs it." She turned to face him. "I'm honoring my husband's last wish, Major. That's not treason. That's my duty." "Duty to whom?" "To tell the truth. to healing, to the idea that maybe we can be better than our fears make us. A commotion outside interrupted them. Voices raised in anger, the sound of horses arriving at speed. Graves moved to the door, speaking briefly with the guard. "It seems, Mrs. Bennet, that your story is already becoming complicated." The door opened and a civilian entered. Reverend Clark from Red Creek's Methodist Church. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, clothes dusty from hard riding. "Reverend?" Sarah blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Bennet." "Major Graves." He removed his hat, nodding to both. "I've come to present new evidence in this matter." "What kind of evidence?" Graves asked warily. Clark reached into his coat, producing a sheet of paper. "Testimonies from residents of Red Creek. Statements about Mrs. Bennet's character, her actions before the Apache incident." He handed the paper to Graves, who read quickly, his expression changing. "According to this," Graves said slowly, "you've been leaving supplies for travelers on the ridge, treating anyone who came to your door, regardless of race. Is this true?" "Medicine doesn't distinguish between patients," Sarah replied. "There's more," Clark continued. "I've also brought this." He produced another document, a military dispatch from Captain Marcus, sent before the attack. It states that he received political pressure to use Mrs. Bennet's situation as justification for what he calls a decisive action against the hostiles. Graves read the second paper, his face growing grave. "Where did you get this?" "Marcus's own aide, young man named Patterson, came to me last night, couldn't live with his conscience." Clark's eyes met Sarah's. "Mrs. Bennet, I owe you an apology. I've watched you for years, judging your isolation, your grief. I failed to see the good you were doing quietly." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected emotion at finding an ally. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do. And I'm not the only one." Clark gestured toward the window. "There are people waiting outside, people who want to testify on your behalf." She moved to the window and saw a small crowd gathered near the stockade. Tom Kinley, who ran the stable, Mrs. Avery, who'd been so quick to judge, even old man Foster from the general store. They saw her looking, and several raised hands in greeting. "What changed their minds?" she asked. "The truth," Clark said simply. "About the military's real reasons for the attack. About the families that escaped because of your actions. About the difference between justice and politics." Major Graves was studying the documents, frowning deeply. "Reverend, these materials put us in a difficult position. The position you're in, Major, is between doing what's expedient and doing what's right. I'm here to make sure you understand the difference. And what do you suggest? Release Mrs. Bennet to my custody while proper charges are considered. Let her story be heard fully before judgments are made." Graves was quiet for a long moment, weighing decisions that reached far beyond one small stockade at one remote fort. "There will be consequences," he said finally. "The governor expects a certain narrative. Then perhaps the governor needs to be educated about the real narrative." Sarah interrupted. She thought of the children in the Apache camp, of storm watchers, quick intelligence, of the medicine woman's deep knowledge. "Major, what if I told you the Apache are already negotiating for peace, that Tall Bear was at a council trying to establish safe passage for tribes to move to the reservation voluntarily?" Is this true? It was. Before men with badges decided peace wasn't profitable enough, she moved closer to Graves. "You have a choice now, the same one I had. You can perpetuate the lie that keeps the war going, or you can choose truth that might lead to actual peace." The Major's weathered hands shuffled the papers again. Then, with deliberate care, he placed them on the bench. "Reverend Clark, I'm releasing Mrs. Bennet to your custody pending investigation of these new developments." "Thank you, Major. Don't thank me yet." Graves turned to Sarah. "You'll need to remain in Red Creek. Speak to no newspaper reporters. And so help me, if you disappear again to play nurse to any more fugitives, I'll be where you expect me to be," Sarah promised. As they prepared to leave, Graves caught her arm. "Mrs. Bennet, one more thing. That paper, the one with testimony, about Apache healing practices, medical observations, did you write it?" "I did. The Surgeon General has been asking for this kind of information for years, trying to understand why Apache warriors survive wounds that kill our soldiers." He hesitated. "Would you be willing to submit it officially, with your name attached?" Sarah considered. It was a door opening, a way for her knowledge to serve beyond. "In conflict beyond sides, I would, with one condition. Yes, include testimony about their medicine woman. Her knowledge equals any doctor I've trained with back east. Give credit where it's due." Graves smiled slightly. "You don't make things easy, do you?" "Easy rarely leads to right, Major." Outside, the crowd had grown. Sarah emerged into sunshine. That felt different somehow, cleaner. The faces watching her held more curiosity than judgment now. Mrs. Avery stepped forward, wringing her hands. "Mrs. Bennet, we owe you several apologies." "Apologies are given to equals," Sarah replied gently. "All I ever wanted was to be seen as equal to the task of helping whoever needed it." Tom Kinley cleared his throat. "Speaking of help, your cabin, what's left of it, could be rebuilt, assuming you want to stay." Sarah looked around at faces that had spent 3 years treating her as other, now offering acceptance. Then she looked west, toward the mountains where an Apache camp had been, where families had escaped, where different songs carried different truths. "I'll stay," she said, "but not to rebuild what was. Maybe it's time for something new entirely." As they prepared to ride back to Red Creek, Storm Watcher materialized at the edge of the crowd, or Sarah thought it was him. The young man caught her eye briefly, nodded once, then melted away before soldiers could react. At that moment, she understood that her story was far from over. The ride home was different than any she'd experienced. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Bennet rode not in isolation, but surrounded by her community. Reverend Clark spoke quietly of changes coming, of new understanding needed, of bridges to be built between worlds that had collided too violently for too long. "The newspapers will still call for blood," he warned. "Politicians will still want their war. Let them," Sarah said. "Truth has a way of emerging even through lies." By the time they reached the ruins of her cabin, sunset was painting the sky in familiar colors. The burnt timbers cast long shadows, but already she could see how the land might be healed, how new growth might emerge from ash. Tom Kinley surveyed the damage. "Could have a new cabin by winter, bigger if you want." "I want," Sarah said, surprising herself. "And maybe include a space for teaching, for sharing different kinds of medicine." Mrs. Avery's eyebrows rose. "Teaching what?" "Everything I've learned, from textbooks and from experience, from white doctors and from Apache healers, from grief and from hope." She looked at the woman who had once led the charge against her. "Would you be interested in learning, Mrs. Avery?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Then slowly, Mrs. Avery nodded. "I might be, at that." As the townspeople dispersed, promising to return with lumber and labor, Reverend Clark lingered. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what you've done, standing between two worlds, refusing to let either claim you exclusively, it's going to change things around here. Things need changing, Reverend. The question is whether we're brave enough to be part of it. Are you?" She looked west again, where drums might still be heard if you knew how to listen, where families were rebuilding their own lives, where different truths waited to be acknowledged. "I don't know about brave," she said, "but I'm too tired to be frightened anymore, and sometimes that's the same thing." That night, Sarah slept in the Methodist church, in a small room Reverend Clark kept for travelers. But before she closed her eyes, she opened the window and listened to the desert night. Somewhere in the distance, almost beyond hearing, came the sound of drums. Not warning, not farewell, but something else, something like a greeting, something like approval. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, newspaper interviews to deflect, politicians to face, a community to rebuild in more ways than one. But tonight, Sarah Bennett went to sleep knowing she had finally chosen a side. The side of healing, regardless of cost. The transformation was far from complete, but it had begun. And sometimes beginning was the hardest part of any journey. In her dreams, she didn't see storms or warnings or the faces of those she'd lost. Instead, she dreamed of a new cabin, with rooms for teaching, with windows facing all directions, with doors that never locked. She dreamed of children, Apache and white, learning together, of women sharing different healing traditions, of men putting down guns to pick up tools for building instead of destroying. Was it possible? Could one woman's choice to heal, instead of harm, truly change anything? The drums seemed to say yes. The desert wind seemed to whisper maybe. And her own heart, finally free from fear, whispered, "We'll see, tomorrow would tell." But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Bennett slept with hope for companionship. Outside her window, the stars wheeled onward, promising nothing, but somehow offering everything. The journey toward transformation had begun. What came next remained unwritten, but no longer untouchable. Some storms, Sarah had learned, were meant to be weathered alone. Others required you to reach across impossible divides and trust that someone, somehow, would reach back. She had reached across. Hands had reached back. What they built together remained to be seen. But the foundation, hard-won and blood-bought, was finally in place. Tomorrow would be the first day of whatever came next. Sarah Bennett faced it not with certainty, but with the kind of hope that only blooms in ground that's been burned and watered with tears. It was enough. It had to be enough. And maybe, just maybe, it was everything she'd been searching for without knowing its name. The drums faded into silence. The desert settled into the night. And in a small room in Red Creek, a woman who had learned to speak the language of healing across cultures closed her eyes and trusted that morning would bring its own kind of grace. Even if that grace looked like work, even if it tasted like sacrifice, even if it required her to remain standing in the space between worlds until others found the courage to cross their own bridges. Sarah Bennett had made her choice. Now came the beautiful, terrible work of living. The transformation had begun. The story would continue to write itself, one choice, one day, one song at a time, and somewhere in the vast desert night, a nation held its breath, waiting to see what grew from the ashes of old certainties. Change rarely came easily, but it came. It always came. The question was whether you helped it along or stood in its way. Sarah had made her choice. She would help it along, no matter what storms still waited on the horizon. After all, she'd weathered worse. And this time, she wouldn't have to weather them alone. That was the real transformation, not just in her, but in the world she'd chosen to inhabit. A world where healers were needed more than warriors, where bridges mattered more than walls, where the courage to care might, prove stronger than the habit of hate. Time would tell. But for the first time in years, Sarah Bennett was willing to wait and see what time might bring. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, while outside the desert kept its endless watch, holding all stories, those already told and those yet to come. Tomorrow would begin the next chapter. Tonight was for rest, for healing, for the quiet gathering of strength. Sarah Bennett slept, and in sleeping began to dream of a future she had never dared imagine before. It was the beginning, and sometimes beginning was everything. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of her new cabin, watching the sunrise paint the mesa in colors that reminded her of war paint. But this morning held no drums, no warnings, no gathering storms. Just the quiet anticipation of a day that would change everything. The cabin had been rebuilt larger, with walls thick enough to withstand winter winds and windows facing all 4 directions. The main room served as a surgery and teaching space, complete with shelves of medical supplies, both familiar and new. Jars of white man's medicine sat alongside bundles of Apache herbs, each labeled in both English and the careful script Stormwatcher had taught her. Tom Kinley had overseen the construction. His initial reluctance transformed into genuine pride. At the project, Mrs. Avery had organized a quilting circle that produced curtains for every window and blankets for every bed. Even Old Man Foster had contributed, installing brass hinges that would never rust and creating shelves strong enough to hold the medical books that were beginning to arrive from the back east. But today wasn't about architecture or community solidarity. Today was about a promise kept. "They're coming," Windrunner announced, appearing at the edge of her yard with the silent efficiency Sarah had learned to expect. He wore white man's clothes today, clean cotton shirt, new brown trousers, but his hair remained traditionally braided and his bearing unmistakably Apache, all of them, all who can make the journey. He studied her face. "Are you ready?" Sarah looked down at her hands, clean now, nails trimmed, but bearing small scars that told their own stories. "I've been ready for months." The agreement had been carefully negotiated through intermediaries. Tall Bear's band would come to Red Creek once monthly for medical care and trade. In exchange, Sarah would continue learning their healing methods and serve as interpreter when needed. It was a small step toward the larger peace that seemed always just out of reach. But it was a step forward rather than back. The townspeople began gathering along Main Street as the sound of hoofbeats approached. No weapons in sight this time, though Sarah knew enough about frontier life to suspect they were close at hand. Caution had become a habit on all sides. Tall Bear rode at the front, his bearing proud despite the healing wound that still caused him to favor his left side. Behind him came Stormwatcher and the medicine woman whose Apache name Sarah could now pronounce, though still struggled to say correctly. Following them, a long line of riders and walkers, perhaps 25 in all. The procession stopped at the edge of town, exactly where they'd agreed. Neutral ground, visible to all, threatening to none. Sarah walked forward alone, medical, bag in hand but rifle left home. It was a choice that had taken months to make with confidence. "You look well," Tall Bear observed as she approached. "You look healed. My stitches held, your stitches held, as did your promise." She nodded toward the cabin. "Everything is ready. Patient rooms in the back, teaching space in the main room. The surgical area meets Army standards, according to the inspector from Fort Collins. And your people." He gestured toward the crowd of townspeople. "They are ready for this?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "Some are. Some will need time. Fear doesn't disappear overnight on either side." "No," the medicine woman said, her English still heavily accented but clear. "Fear becomes understanding slowly, like a wound becoming scar." They proceeded to the cabin together, the mixed group creating a scene that would have been unimaginable months ago. Apache warriors sharing space with white settlers, children of both worlds eyeing each other with curiosity rather than terror. The medical work began immediately. A warrior with an infected shoulder wound, a child with a persistent cough, an elderly woman whose joint pain had worsened with the changing seasons. Sarah moved between patients with practiced efficiency, the medicine woman at her side, their collaboration now smooth with practice. Stormwatcher had taken on the role of translator, for both medical terms and cultural nuances that crossed between worlds. His English had improved dramatically, aided by evening lessons with Reverend Clark, who had developed an unexpected interest in Apache linguistics. "Mrs. Bennet," called Mrs. Avery from the doorway, "several women are asking about the herbal preparations you mentioned, the ones for childbirth." Sarah looked up from bandaging a sprained ankle. In the early days, such a question from Mrs. Avery would have carried judgment, suspicion. Now it held genuine curiosity. "Come in. The medicine woman and I were planning to demonstrate today's lesson anyway." What followed was a scene Sarah had dreamed of, but hardly dared hope for. White women and Apache women sitting together, sharing knowledge about plants and preparations, life cycles and healing traditions. Language barriers were overcome with gestures, drawings, and the universal understanding of women helping women. Midday brought a shared meal, not elaborate, but symbolic. Stew cooked by the Methodist church ladies served alongside dried meat and corn, prepared in traditional Apache fashion. People ate separately at first, but gradually the boundaries softened. Tom Kinley found himself discussing horse training techniques with Windrunner. Foster's daughter shyly shared peppermint candy with an Apache girl of similar age. It wasn't perfect integration. Eyes still held wariness. Hands didn't yet reach across to shake without hesitation, but it was progress, measurable in small acts, of acknowledgement rather than grand gestures. Late afternoon brought an unexpected development. A military patrol appeared on the ridge, not threatening but observing. Major Graves himself led them, accompanied by a civilian in official-looking. "Clothes, that's the territorial inspector," Stormwatcher murmured. "From Santa Fe. They've been watching this arrangement." Sarah felt the gathering tense. This was the test they'd all known would come. The demonstration had to prove itself not just as charity or sentiment, but as a viable path forward. "Continue with everything as planned," Tall Bear advised quietly. "Let them see normal life, not performance." For the next hour, Sarah conducted her scheduled teaching session on field surgery, while the inspector observed. Apache and white residents learned together how to treat gunshot wounds, set broken bones, recognize signs of infection. The information was practical, necessary for frontier life regardless of politics. When Major Graves and his party approached the cabin, the room fell silent. "Quite an operation you've established here, Mrs. Bennet," the inspector said, his voice carefully neutral. "I've established a medical practice, sir. The operation belongs to all of us." She gestured to the mixed crowd. "These people have chosen to learn from each other rather than fear each other. And the military implications? There are no military implications. There's a medical practice serving whoever needs it, and a community choosing education over isolation." The inspector walked the room, studying the supplies, observing the interactions. He paused beside the shelves, where two pharmacologies existed side by side. "These Apache preparations, are they effective?" The medicine woman understood enough English to respond. "Work for 1,000 years. White medicine is new, powerful for some things. Old medicine is powerful for other things. Together, more powerful than either alone." It was perhaps the longest statement she'd made in English, and the inspector seemed to appreciate its significance. "Major Graves," he said finally, "I'll need to see all the documentation regarding this arrangement. But preliminarily, it appears to align with the territory's objectives of peaceful integration and mutual benefit." As the official party prepared to leave, Graves lingered beside Sarah. "You've created something unusual here," he said quietly. "Something that might actually work. People working together usually does work, Major. We just forget that sometimes." He nodded. "The war isn't over, Mrs. Bennet. There will be incidents, conflicts, those who resist any change." "I know. But wars end with people making different choices. Today, some people made different choices. After the officials departed, the gathering gradually concluded. The Apache prepared to return to their camp before darkness fell. As they organized for departure, Tall Bear approached Sarah one final time. "You have done more than heal the wound," he said. "You have begun to heal the distance between worlds. We've all begun it, together." He removed a small pouch from his belt, different from the one she'd received before, this one decorated with intricate beadwork. "From the medicine woman, for your hands. She says the songs work better when the hands are prepared." Sarah accepted the gift, feeling its weight. "Will I see you next month?" "Every month until the snows grow too deep, and in spring we return again. This is our path now." As the Apache delegation rode away, Sarah stood on her porch, watching until they disappeared behind the mesa. Around her, the town of Red Creek settled into evening routine, shopkeepers closing stores, families gathering for supper, the saloon beginning to fill with its regular clientele. But something had changed in these familiar rhythms. Children who had witnessed the day's events carried new questions home. Women had recipes for remedies they'd never known before. Men had shared skills across cultural divides they'd previously thought impossible to bridge. Reverend Clark joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Quite a day," he observed. "First of many, I hope. Sarah, can I ask you something?" Looking back, if you had known what choosing to help Tall Bear would lead to, the destruction of your old life, the months of uncertainty, the risk to everything familiar, would you still have opened that door during the storm? She thought about it, really thought, staring out at the desert that had become home in ways she'd never imagined when she first came west. The storm was already here, Reverend, in the land, in the people, in the hate that built walls between neighbors. I just stopped hiding from it long enough to see there might be a way through. And now, Sarah opened the pouch Tall Bear had given her, revealing dried herbs mixed with small, polished stones, each one catching the last light of sunset. "Now, I know that storms pass, that wounds can heal, that people can learn to see each other as human beings rather than enemies." She met his gaze. "Yes, I would open that door again every time." As darkness fell over Red Creek, lights began appearing in windows, familiar and warm. But tonight, they meant something different. Tonight, they represented not just individual homes, but collective possibility, a town that had chosen to risk change rather than cling to familiar fear. In her cabin, Sarah prepared for tomorrow's patients, both scheduled and the unexpected ones that frontier life always brought. She organized supplies meticulously, placing traditional remedies alongside modern medicines, ensuring everything was ready for whoever might need care. Before bed, she stood at her east-facing window, looking toward the mountains where Apache camps were settling into their own evening routines. Somewhere out there, Stormwatcher was probably teaching English words to his younger cousins. The medicine woman was preparing tomorrow's teaching materials. Tall Bear was making decisions that balanced tradition with the changing requirements of survival. Sarah pulled out the paper she'd been writing on for weeks, her comprehensive guide to frontier medicine, combining everything she'd learned from both worlds. Tomorrow she'd continue working on it, adding today's lessons, documenting the collaboration that was proving more effective than either tradition alone. But tonight was for quiet reflection, for acknowledging how far they'd all traveled from that storm-dark morning when she'd first opened her door to a wounded enemy who became a teacher, a friend, a bridge to understanding. She opened her window slightly, letting the desert night air flow through. In the distance, almost beyond hearing, came the sound she'd been listening for. Drums, not of warning but of celebration. The soft rhythm spoke of families safe, of healing accomplished, of promises kept. Sarah smiled, closing her eyes to listen better. The drums seemed to say, "This is how change happens. One choice, one person, one open door at a time. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be setbacks, resistances, moments when fear threatened to overwhelm hope. But tonight, in a cabin that stood as testament to what could be built when people chose cooperation over conflict, Sarah Bennett felt something she'd lost. 3 years ago, when her husband died, she felt the solid certainty of knowing her place in the world, not as a widow hiding from life, not as a woman defined by loss, but as a healer who had learned that the deepest wounds were often the ones between people, and that those could be healed too, though it required patience, courage, and the willingness to stand in dangerous spaces. Until others felt safe enough to join you, the drums faded into silence. The desert settled into its ancient rhythms. And in a new cabin in Red Creek, a woman who had learned to speak the languages of both loss and healing prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring the beautiful work of building bridges, one patient, one lesson, one choice at a time. Some storms, she had discovered, weren't meant to be weathered alone. They were meant to be navigated together, with hands outstretched across divides that had once seemed impossible to cross. She had reached out her hand during one such storm. Others had reached back, and together they had begun to build something that neither side could have created alone. It was the beginning of a story still being written, not with bullets or politics, but with small acts of daily bravery, with medicine shared across cultural lines, with children learning together, with women teaching women, with men finding common ground in the work of survival and building. Sarah Bennett closed her eyes and let sleep take her, while outside her window, the desert kept its endless watch, holding all stories, witnessing all transformations, waiting patiently for the next chapter to unfold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new possibilities, and sometimes that balance was enough to sustain hope through even the longest nights. The frontier was changing, one heart, one choice, one open door at a time. And in a small cabin in Arizona Territory, a nurse who had learned to heal more than bodies slept peacefully, knowing she had played her part in that transformation. The drums were silent now, but their promise echoed still, written in the very walls of a home built not for isolation but for gathering, not for fear but for healing, not for one but for all who came with open hearts and willing hands. Some mornings changed everything. This had been one of them, and tomorrow promised to be another. Sarah Bennett slept and dreamed of bridges, of children learning, of wounds that healed cleanly, of doors that stayed open no matter what storms might come. She had found her way home, not to the place she'd been, but to the place she was becoming. And in that becoming, she had become more than she'd ever thought possible. The story wasn't finished. Stories like this never truly end. They just continue, spreading outward like ripples in still water, touching lives and changing futures in ways too vast to measure but too important to ignore. And sometimes, if you listened carefully in the desert night, you could still hear them being told, in drumbeats and whispered prayers, in shared meals and joined hands, in the quiet revolution of people choosing to see each other as human. Dawn would come soon enough, and with it another day of building bridges, one careful step at a time. But for now there was rest, there was peace, there was the deep satisfaction of work well begun and purpose finally found. Sarah Bennett had weathered her storm. Now came the even greater challenge and reward of helping others weather theirs. In the vast Arizona sky, stars wheeled onward, bearing witness to the small acts of courage that changed the world. And in a cabin that faced all directions, a woman who had learned to heal across every boundary, slept with windows open to the night. Tomorrow would bring its own gifts and challenges. Tonight was for gratitude, for rest, for the quiet accumulation of strength needed for the continuing work. Frontier had shaped her. Now she was helping to shape it in return. It was enough. It was everything. It was the beginning of a future written not in division, but in the slow, patient work of healing the distance between worlds. And in the desert darkness, the land itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction at a story that proved how much could change when someone was brave enough to open a door and step across the threshold into uncertainty. Some bridges are built with stone and timber, others are built with outstretched hands and willing hearts. Both require engineers brave enough to span impossible distances. Sarah Bennett had become that kind of engineer, and the bridge she was building would stand long after her own story ended, carrying others toward a future where the color of skin mattered less than the content of character, where healing hands were valued above weapons, where the word neighbor included everyone who shared the same sky. The circle was complete, the storm had passed, and in its wake something new had begun to grow. Sarah slept, the desert watched, and tomorrow promised to continue a story that had only just begun to reveal its true scope and meaning. In the end, it had all started with a choice made during a storm. Like most important things, it was both that simple and that profound. The rest was just the beautiful work of living that choice, one day, one patient, one bridge-building moment at a time. Dawn approached, and with it, endless possibility. Sarah Bennett was ready. She had been ready since the morning she chose healing over fear, connection over isolation, truth over convenience. Now came the harvest of that choice, and it was richer than she had ever dared to imagine. The story continued, as the best stories always do, one sunrise at a time, one opened the door at a time, one heart at a time, until the desert itself seemed to sing with the promise of all that was yet to come. The end was a beginning, as the best endings always are, and somewhere in the vast Arizona territory, drums beat softly in celebration of what had been accomplished and in anticipation of all that was yet to come. The bridge was built, the circle was complete, the transformation was underway, and Sarah Bennett, frontier nurse and bridge builder, continued her work in a world that was finally beginning to understand the true meaning of healing. It was enough. It was everything. It was the only thing that had ever really mattered. The sun rose, the work continued, the story went on. As stories of transformation always do, long after their first telling, echoing forward through time like ripples on still water, changing everything they touch, forever and always. One choice at a time, one opened the door at a time, one healed heart at a time. This was the real ending, and the real beginning, and the truth that lay between them, where all the best stories live, in the space where worlds meet and healing becomes possible, where courage looks like an open door and transformation begins with a simple choice. Sarah Bennett had made her choice. The rest was just the echo of that decision reverberating through time and space, changing everything it touched, as it always had, as it always would, as it always must. For this is how change happens. One storm, one door, one opened heart at a time, the end and the beginning. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows of the Red Creek School of Frontier Medicine as Sarah Bennett, now director of the institution, made her morning rounds. The original cabin had expanded into a complex of buildings, a proper surgery, a teaching hall, dormitories for traveling students, and a clinic that never closed its doors. Her students this term included 3 young Apache women learning European medical techniques, 2 white settlers' daughters studying traditional herbal medicine, and a mixed blood translator whose facility with languages made him invaluable for the growing exchange programs with neighboring tribes. Dr. Bennett? The voice belonged to Marie, one of her first Apache students, now graduated and practicing independently. The delegation from Phoenix has arrived. They're early, Sarah set down her pen, where she'd been finishing notes for tomorrow's lecture on field surgery. The territorial governor had dispatched an official commission to study what newspapers had started calling the Red Creek model of cross-cultural medical cooperation. In the courtyard, she found 3 men in official dress surrounded by a curious crowd of students, patients, and townspeople. The tallest, wearing a badge that marked him as Territorial Health Commissioner, stepped forward. "Dr. Bennett, I'm Commissioner Wallace. We've come to see for ourselves this remarkable institution we've been hearing about." "Not remarkable," Sarah corrected gently, "just necessary. Would you like to begin with the morning clinic?" What followed was a guided tour that showcased 5 years of careful work. The commissioner observed traditional Apache bone-setting techniques being taught alongside modern wound care. He witnessed a joint surgery performed by Sarah and Running Deer. The medicine woman had taken an English name for official interactions, combining methodologies with remarkable results. In the teaching hall, Stormwatcher, now wearing the title of assistant director, conducted a bilingual anatomy lesson. The precision of his Latin rivaled any Eastern medical school, while his Apache terminology preserved knowledge that went back generations. "Extraordinary," Wallace murmured, watching white and Apache students work together to treat a compound fracture. "How many graduates are now practicing?" 47, Sarah replied. 12 have established clinics on reservations. 15 practice in frontier communities. 20 serve in various capacities with the Territorial Medical Service. And incidents? Conflicts? "We've had our challenges," Sarah admitted. "Not everyone believed this was possible, but the work proves itself. When your child is burning with fever, you don't care what color hands bring the medicine." As they moved through the facilities, Sarah noticed with satisfaction how naturally integrated everything had become. The early awkwardness, the careful dance of cultural boundaries, had evolved into genuine collaboration. Students switched between languages without thought, combined healing traditions as naturally as breathing, shared meals, and study sessions without the self-consciousness that had marked those first months. In the herb garden, an unexpected sight greeted them. Tall Bear, now using the name Dr. Whitehorse in mixed company, teaching a class on plant identification. At 65, the former war chief had traded his weapons for a professor's titles, becoming the institution's first indigenous faculty member. "Ah, Commissioner," he said, removing his gardening gloves. "Come to see if our little experiment still stands?" "More than stands," Wallace admitted. "Flourishes, apparently. I've read the statistics. Mortality rates in your treatment zones have dropped by 40%. Recovery times are significantly faster. When you combine the best of different worlds, Commissioner, you get something stronger than either alone." Tall Bear gestured to his students, a mixed group clustered around a particularly rare medicinal plant. "These young people will go out and multiply our work. In 10 years, traditional healing won't be disappearing. It will be integrated into standard practice." The afternoon brought a surprise Sarah hadn't anticipated on the tour itinerary. Commissioner Wallace produced an official document from his satchel. "Dr. Bennett, Running Deer, Dr. Whitehorse, I've been authorized to present this." He unrolled the certificate. "The Territorial Board of Health, by unanimous vote, officially recognizes the Red Creek School of Frontier Medicine as the Territory's first accredited institution for cross-cultural medical education. Federal funding has been approved to support expansion." The spontaneous cheer that arose wasn't just from the immediate gathering, but from everywhere students and patients had congregated to catch pieces of the historic visit. 5 years of proving themselves had culminated in official recognition. That evening, the regularly scheduled monthly gathering took on special significance. What had begun as Sarah's arrangement with Tall Bear's band had evolved into a community festival. Apache families arrived bringing traditional foods and instruments. Red Creek residents contributed with equal enthusiasm, having long since moved past toleration to genuine welcome. The old medicine woman, now called grandmother by half the town regardless of race, presided over the feast with the same quiet authority she'd always carried. At 92, she remained the final arbiter of difficult medical cases and the keeper of the oldest healing songs. After dinner, as drums began their familiar rhythm, Commissioner Wallace found himself seated between Sarah and Reverend Clark, who had become the school's official chaplain and cultural liaison. "Tell me honestly," Wallace said, "what's the real secret? How did you transform what should have been impossible into the model the entire territory wants to emulate?" Sarah and Clark exchanged glances, sharing an unspoken history. "The secret," Sarah said slowly, "isn't a secret at all. It's simply choosing to see people as people, choosing healing over harm, choosing bridge building over wall building. It started with one storm," Clark added, smiling at her. "One door opened, one choice made despite fear. And every day since then," Sarah continued, "thousands of small choices. Students choosing to learn from each other, families choosing to trust, healers choosing to share knowledge instead of hoarding it." As if to illustrate her point, a group of children, Apache, white, mixed blood, ran past chasing fireflies, their laughter mixing with the drum music. To an outside observer, it would be impossible to tell which background any of them came from. They were simply children playing together on a warm evening, as children always had, before adults taught them the artificial boundaries of race and nation. "Your success has created some pressure," Wallace admitted. "Other territories are watching. Washington is watching. There are those who see integration as a threat to traditional order." "Traditional order," Tallbear said pointedly, "brought us to the edge of mutual extinction. We chose survival instead, adaptation instead, growth instead." The conversation might have turned heavier, but Stormwatcher appeared with his two young sons, introducing them proudly to the commissioner. Both boys bore mixed heritage. Their mother was the daughter of the town baker, a match that would have been scandalous 5 years ago, and now barely warranted comment. "Tell me, boys," Wallace said kindly, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" "Doctors," they chorused. Then the older added, "like Dr. Sarah and Grandfather Tallbear." The simplicity of their answer, the matter-of-fact inclusion of both white and Apache mentors, perhaps spoke more powerfully than any statistics or formal presentations about how completely the world had shifted in this small corner of the frontier. As darkness settled and the festival continued, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the scene she'd witnessed from so many different perspectives over the years. The first tentative interactions, the careful negotiations, the gradual building of trust. Now this. A community that had created its own version of normal, where cultural exchange was as natural as breathing. Windrunner joined her, his hair now streaked with silver, but his bearing still erect. "You should be proud," he said simply. "We all should be. It wasn't my work alone. No, but you opened the door. That took particular courage." They watched in comfortable silence as the drums shifted to a new rhythm, one that had evolved specifically from these gatherings. Not purely Apache, not purely white settler, but something uniquely Red Creek. "Sometimes," Sarah said softly, "I think about that morning. The storm, the fear, the choice. How easily I could have kept that door closed. But you didn't. No, I didn't. And now look at what grows from that choice. Indeed, the sprawling medical campus, the thriving exchange programs, the dozens of graduates establishing similar initiatives across the territory. It was almost too much to connect to that single moment 5 years ago. Almost too much, but not quite. Sarah had learned that transformations, however vast they appeared in retrospect, always began with individual choices made in specific moments. The magnitude came from the accumulation of smaller choices made by others who caught the vision and carried it forward. The evening wound down gradually. Families began gathering children. Elderly made their way home. The drums softened to a gentle background rhythm. Commissioner Wallace sought her out before departing, his official reserve completely gone. "Dr. Bennett, I came here expecting to find an interesting experiment. Instead, I've witnessed what might be the future of the frontier." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There will be resistance to expansion, political forces that prefer the old antagonisms. There's always resistance to change," Sarah agreed. "But there's also momentum. People see what works. Parents want their children to be healers, not warriors. Communities choose prosperity over conflict when they're given real alternatives." "Well said." He shook her hand formally. "Expect more. Visitors. More scrutiny, more pressure, both positive and negative. We'll handle it the same way we've handled everything else. One day at a time, one patient at a time, one student at a time." After he departed, Sarah made her final rounds of the evening. In the women's ward, she checked on an Apache grandmother whose granddaughter had walked 50 miles to bring her for surgery. In the men's section, she monitored a cowboy recovering from a rattlesnake bite, treated with a combination of modern antivenoms and traditional Apache cure. In the children's recovery room, she found a young running deer, named for her now-deceased teacher, reading to a mixed group of patients. The story was in English, but peppered with Apache phrases that all the children understood. When she finished, one of the white children asked for it to be repeated in full Apache. Normal medical practice now included honoring such requests as part of holistic healing. At her desk that night, Sarah opened the leather journal she'd maintained since the beginning. 5 years of entries documenting not just medical cases, but cultural milestones, personal transformations, community evolution. Today's entry began simply, "Official recognition." Federal funding approved. Commissioner's visit was successful, but then she paused, pen hovering over paper, considering what really mattered about this day. Finally she wrote, "The children asked for the story in Apache. Their eyes showed no division between languages, between cultures, between ways of being. They simply wanted to understand better in all the ways available to them." This, perhaps, is the real measure of our success. Not the certificates or funding, but the naturalness with which the next generation moves between worlds we once thought unbridgeable. The drums tonight played rhythms we never knew before we began this work. New patterns emerging from old traditions. The medicine garden grows plants that were once strangers to each other. The students speak languages that borrow freely from multiple sources. We have created something that belongs fully to no single tradition because it springs from the marriage of many. This is the kind of strength forged from diversity, the power that emerges when walls become doorways. Tonight, I remember that storm, that door, that choice. But I think now of the choices made by hundreds of others. Every student who stayed to learn what was unfamiliar, every family who trusted again after loss, every healer who shared what others might have hoarded. This is how worlds change, not through single heroes or dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated courage of ordinary people making extraordinary choices to see in each other the common humanity that binds all things. Tomorrow brings new patients, new students, new challenges, but it also brings the continuation of a story that has proven larger than any of us imagined when it began. The frontier changes us all, but we can choose how. We can choose to be changed toward greater understanding, broader vision, deeper capacity for both giving and receiving. This is our ongoing choice. Our daily practice, our humble work toward a future that belongs to all. She closed the journal, extinguished the lamp, and walked to her window. The desert night was clear, stars brilliant against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called and was answered by another. In 5 years, the Red Creek School of Frontier Medicine had grown from an impossible dream to a thriving reality. Its graduates would spread across the territory and beyond, carrying not just medical knowledge, but a proven model for how different worlds could strengthen each other through respectful collaboration. There would be setbacks. There would be resistance. There would be those who preferred the old certainties of separation and conflict. But there would also be more children asking for stories in multiple languages, more hands reaching across divides, more lives saved through the combining of different wisdom traditions. Sarah Bennett went to sleep that night knowing her choice to open one door during one storm had sparked something far larger than she could have imagined, not because she was remarkable, but because she had been willing to step into uncertainty and do the small, immediate work of healing whoever stood before her. The rest had grown from there, the way all transformation does. One choice, one door, one bridge at a time. In the morning, the work would continue, because it was always beginning, because healing was not a destination, but a practice, because bridges required constant tending to remain strong, but tonight was for gratitude, for the miracle of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, for the slow alchemy of turning strangers into neighbors, enemies into allies, fear into understanding, for the drums that still beat gently in the distance, carrying rhythms old and new across a land that was learning finally to sing a song large enough to include all its children. Sarah Bennett slept peacefully, as she had not slept in years before that storm-swept morning when everything changed. Outside her window, the desert kept its eternal watch, holding all the stories, witnessing all transformations, and preparing always for whatever dawn might bring. Some storms, it turned out, were exactly what they seemed, not disasters to be weathered, but invitations to begin the work of remaking the world into something more spacious, more generous, more true to its highest possibilities. This was the lesson written in the very architecture of the Red Creek School of Frontier Medicine, read daily in the faces of its graduates, heard in the multilingual pulse of its community gatherings, felt in the steady hands that reached across every boundary to do what they'd always done best, the simple, sacred work of helping people heal. Storm had passed. The door remained open. The bridge stood firm, and the story continued, as the best stories always do, in the willing hearts of those who chose to carry it forward. Day by day, moment by moment, one opened hand at a time, until the desert itself seemed to smile with the satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled, challenge met, and promise kept. This was how change happened, slowly, steadily, with the persistence of water wearing. Down stone, love wearing down fear, hope wearing down despair. One choice, one door, one bridge, one life at a time, forever and always. In the vast story of the frontier, where all paths eventually led to the same truth, we are more alike than different. We are stronger together than apart. We are all, finally, family. Under the same wide sky, Sarah Bennett had opened her door to this truth 5 years ago. Now it opened doors for countless others, and the work continued, as it always had, as it always would, in the capable hands of those who understood that healing wasn't just medicine. It was the persistent, daily choice to see humanity in everyone who crossed your path. The drums were silent now, but their echo lived on in the heartbeat of a community that had learned to live by their rhythm. Dawn approached. Another day, another chance, another opening. Sarah Bennett was ready. She had been ready since that storm taught her the real meaning of her calling, to heal, to bridge. To choose connection over separation every single day, no matter how difficult the work became. This was the legacy of the Red Creek School. This was the gift of those willing to open doors in storms. This was the promise of a future built on the foundation of that first brave choice, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The sun rose, the work continued, the story went on, as it always had. As it always would, as long as there were people willing to open doors and build bridges and choose healing over harm. One choice, one door, one bridge, one life at a time, until the whole world changed, and then beyond into mysteries yet to be discovered, healings yet to be performed, communities yet to be built, and bridges yet to be crossed. This was the real work, the eternal work. The work that made everything else possible. And Sarah Bennett, frontier nurse and bridge builder, continued to do her part, one patient, one student, one open door at a time, as did everyone she had taught and inspired. As would everyone they, taught and inspired in turn, on, rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, changing everything, forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.